Today for Devotions with Daniela, we are reading from the first book of Daniela, Uncultured, about growing up in the Children of God religious cult and going into the cult of the U.S. Army. So we are deployed to Afghanistan. I am 27 years old, and I am the captain that is in charge of the intelligence for the unit, which is the expert on the bad guy, as I remain. There is a sexual harassment case that is being blown out of control, turned into a pretty large witch hunt, and I've been accused of retaliation and fomenting an environment of sexual assault and harassment for women in the unit. Yeah, ridiculous. I was told I'd be removed from my position as the senior intelligence officer. Not fired, of course, but sent up to work at brigade headquarters for Colonel Maxwell directly. I'd been around long enough to know that meant fired, and so did every one of my colleagues and subordinates, who looked at me speechless when I told them. To add insult to injury, First Lieutenant Stephen Wilson, the one I'd been training for 2 years as my deputy, wouldn't be given my role as replacement, but a different lieutenant, a mere 2 weeks senior to him, would be brought in from Fort Campbell to take over for the last 2 months. It was a bad joke, as we all knew it would take her almost that long to get up to speed, and it seemed specifically intended to punish First Lieutenant Wilson, who'd written a strong statement of support in support of my character. And of course, it's very dangerous because the end of a deployment is the most dangerous time. He tried to advocate for himself, explaining to Lieutenant Colonel Halter how dangerous it was to bring in a new senior intelligence officer only 3 months before the end of our tour, the most dangerous time of any deployment. Lieutenant Colonel Halter shook his head, telling Stephen, "Thank you. I understand all you've said, but the decision has already been made since apparently I don't control my own staff." I was crushed for him, and for Lieutenant Colonel Halter too, but there was nothing I could do. My rank, experience, and record in the unit, where I'd spent nearly 5 years, meant next to nothing, especially since I'd told them I planned to leave. I remembered being 15 and yelling at my dad that I wanted to leave the family, how I was then separated from the rest of the group, imprisoned in my room for 6 weeks. All the adults worried I'd poison others with my doubts, with my ideas of the world outside the group. It was the same message. You're choosing to leave the team. You're not one of us anymore. Lieutenant Colonel Halter was one of the few who never adopted that attitude with me. Somehow, with a few sparse words, he always made it obvious that just because he'd chosen a lifelong career in the U.S. Army, he wouldn't judge me for wanting something different. I realized through all his past support of me, he'd been preparing me to get out, if that was what I chose. He would talk to me about life after, other career options, seeming to understand that if he failed to prepare his people for the validity of life outside the group, then he was failing to prepare them for life after the group. I'd even once requested a conference with some junior officers he knew who'd gotten out, so I could ask them what had influenced their decisions. He made it happen while we were deployed. He seemed almost excited for those of us moving on, as if it mattered to him that we chose paths that would make us happy. It was as though he knew the best way to prepare us for a life after the Army was to acknowledge that we would all have one, sooner or later. It reminded me a bit of Mom, how when I was 11, we'd walked around the commune in Bello, talking about life outside the family, her sharing what I now see were her doubts, her questions, the beginning of her recognition that there was maybe an equally valid life outside the commune walls, a way to prepare and encourage me, if I needed, to leave everything I knew behind. And in the end, she'd encouraged me to go. With headaches that became more and more crushing, I continued to try to show up every day to do my job. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I scheduled a meeting with the brigade executive officer, second in command to Colonel Maxwell. I told him I felt I was being fired as a direct result of going public about being a victim of assault myself. I knew people had started to look at me differently, wondering if my past trauma meant I didn't have what it took to be a leader. I knew if I'd written a contrite statement, apologizing for my sins and taking one for the team, the situation would have been different. Carrying the values of candor and character that had become ingrained in me, I shared with him how the abuse I'd lived with since childhood had influenced the work I'd done, not just to overcome, but to help other victims. With that context, I asked him to see why I could not just live with an official reprimand and the words of the accusation. I asked him to consider, as my leader, what mental environment they'd be requiring me to work under. I mentioned doubting my own resiliency, that beloved buzzword of an army already 13 years into an unwinnable war. I didn't want to be another sad statistic. It was all becoming too much. I offered him a way out. Send me home. It wasn't unusual to send individual soldiers home early, and I knew they didn't need me in the new role. In the perpetual chess game of the Army, the brigade executive officer made a move that showed he knew I was seriously struggling. He made it my choice whether or not I'd like to go home, rather than finish out the deployment in a job above my rank. I didn't care what it meant for my career. I was beginning to feel that if I didn't get out of that environment soon, it would kill me. They agreed to send me home. But the next morning, when I opened my eyes after another night, awake more than asleep, I couldn't see. I stretched my hands out in front of my face, waving and snapping my fingers to be sure I wasn't dreaming. Nothing. Actual blackness, like the wires connecting the camera of my eye to the machinery of my brain, had been pinched shut. Panic rose in my chest as I struggled to keep breathing and tried to review my options. I was alone in my shipping container, without a roommate. Nobody would accidentally find me. I slowly placed my feet on the ground, completely blind, and my whole body trembled. I couldn't think straight. Every thought in my head seemed to float away before it could land and make any sense. Words danced around in my head, and I knew when they came out, they would be unintelligible. I picked up my phone, typing in the password from memory, unsure if I got it right, and pressed the dial button, trying to remember the last person I called. "Help me," I croaked, and then a sentence I knew never to say to any man while deployed, certainly not someone subordinate. "Please, come to my room." And we'll get the rest of that tomorrow. You can get signed copies of Uncultured attached here or listen to me read it to you anywhere you get your audiobooks.